Throughout the 19th century, Central Asia hosted a shadow conflict known as the Great Game, defined by the Russian Empire slowly creeping southward. Sitting across the chessboard was the British East India Company. Controlling the Indian subcontinent, British administrators watched this steady territorial advance with mounting paranoia. They calculated that if Russia gained a foothold in the region, a direct invasion of India would soon follow. To be precise, the adversary here was the Tsarist Russian Empire. The Soviet Union wouldn't exist for another 80 years. This was an imperial competition for territory and borders. Into this atmosphere of deep suspicion stepped Lord Auckland, appointed Governor-General of India in 1836. Auckland brought with him a doctrine that would become known as the Forward Policy. The Forward Policy dictated that the British could not afford to wait for a border skirmish. Instead, they needed to preemptively ensure that whoever governed Afghanistan operated in strict alignment with British interests. The goal was to engineer a reliable, controlled buffer state. Auckland was not responding to an actual Afghan attack. His entire geopolitical strategy was driven by a preventative need to slam the door shut on a hypothetical Russian invasion route before it could ever materialize. Auckland initially tried diplomacy. He opened negotiations to form a friendly alliance with the sitting emir of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad. Dost Muhammad was receptive, but he brought one strict, non-negotiable condition to the table. He wanted the East India Company to help him reclaim the city of Peshawar. Here lay the diplomatic deadlock. Peshawar had been captured 4 years earlier, in 1834, by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the ruler of the formidable Sikh Empire. For the British, the math was simple. Ranjit Singh was a powerful, vital ally. They could not risk fracturing that alliance by demanding he hand Peshawar back to the Afghans. When the British refused, a frustrated Dost Muhammad immediately pivoted. To secure his own borders, he opened negotiations with both the Russian Empire and Persia. This sudden diplomatic shift realized Auckland's worst fears. Instead of securing his buffer state, he had pushed the emir toward his enemies. The Forward Policy quickly morphed from a defensive posture into an offensive mandate. The British would forcefully replace the Afghan regime before Russian influence could take root. If Dost Muhammad refused to cooperate, the British needed a ruler who would. They found their candidate in Shah Shuja. Shah Shuja was the former king of Afghanistan. Deposed in 1809, he had been living in exile in Punjab, surviving on an East India Company pension, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim his throne. To formalize their plan, the British drafted the Tripartite Treaty of 1838. First, it bound the East India Company, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and Shah Shuja in a united military front to install Shah Shuja as emir. Second, in exchange for Ranjit Singh's cooperation, Shah Shuja agreed to permanently surrender all Afghan claims to Peshawar, officially ceding it to the Sikh Empire. Third, once in power, Shah Shuja agreed to place Afghanistan's foreign policy under strict British control. On paper, the document appeared brilliantly calculated. The East India Company secured a compliant buffer state, neutralized the contentious Peshawar border dispute, and maintained their crucial Sikh alliance, all without firing a shot. Executing the invasion presented an immediate geographical problem. The most direct route from British India to Kabul ran straight through Punjab, but Maharaja Ranjit Singh explicitly banned British forces from marching across Sikh territory. Consequently, in early 1839, the British Army was forced into a massive detour, marching their forces far to the south and crossing through Sindh. This alternate path forced the stretched-out military column to slowly traverse the punishing, towering gorges of the Bolan Pass just to enter Afghanistan. Despite the harsh terrain, their advance was remarkably rapid. They captured Quetta in March, Kandahar in April, and by July, they breached the massive, multi-layered fortifications of Ghazni. They bypassed these strongholds so quickly because of the unique nature of Afghan military power. The emir did not command a massive, unified standing army. Real military authority was decentralized, held locally by independent tribal chiefs. Rather than fighting a grueling war of attrition against these factions, the East India Company deployed its financial reserves. They bribed the tribal chiefs, systematically buying the military loyalty out from under Dost Muhammad. Isolated and completely abandoned by his local commanders, Dost Muhammad was forced to surrender. By August 1839, Shah Shuja was seated on the throne in Kabul. To the British administration, the invasion looked like a flawless, efficient success. The reality on the ground was far less stable. The local population widely despised Shah Shuja, viewing him as a cruel ruler and a clear foreign puppet. Because Shuja lacked genuine domestic support, the British could not pack up and leave. They were forced to maintain a complacent occupation force, backed by a powerful British resident, permanently stationed in the country to prop up his regime. The local tribal chiefs quickly realized the error in their calculation. The East India Company's bribes were a one-time payout, but the loss of their decentralized autonomy and the permanent presence of foreign troops was a lasting constraint. This friction ignited a fierce, localized nationalist movement. The British found themselves facing a decentralized, grassroots threat that their traditional military apparatus was poorly equipped to handle. The tension violently snapped in 1841. The exact same tribal leaders the British had bought off 2 years earlier turned their militias against the occupation. They assassinated the British resident and began systematically slaughtering isolated garrisons. The East India Company had completely misunderstood the mechanics of Afghan sovereignty. By subjugating the central emir while alienating the tribal chiefs who actually held the power, they engineered their own trap. The British position collapsed entirely. Shah Shuja was forced to flee and was soon killed. The remaining East India Company forces, surrounded and outmaneuvered, signed a humiliating treaty agreeing to fully evacuate the region and allow Dost Muhammad back onto the throne. When news of the catastrophic retreat reached London, the political fallout was immediate. Lord Auckland faced intense parliamentary backlash for the disaster and was officially recalled in early 1842. His replacement, Lord Ellenborough, arrived with a single immediate objective: to exact military retaliation and salvage the empire's battered prestige. Ellenborough launched a punitive expedition later that year. British forces pushed back into Afghanistan and temporarily recaptured Kabul, largely to prove they still could. But Ellenborough was pragmatic, recognizing that a second permanent occupation would inevitably result in another bloody uprising. He made a calculated peace with Dost Muhammad. He officially recognized him as the independent emir, extracting only a promise that the Afghans would not form alliances against the company. Let's examine the final accounting. In 1838, the ruler of Afghanistan was Dost Muhammad. By late 1842, after years of war, the ruler of Afghanistan was still Dost Muhammad. The difference lay entirely in the millions of rupees spent and the thousands of soldiers dead. The First Anglo Afghan War remains a masterclass in geopolitical futility. Lord Auckland's forward policy achieved zero strategic gains, returning the borders exactly to where they started. Yet, in the process, it shattered the psychological myth of British military invincibility in India.